welcome to Storytime with Mr. Warner. Chapter 4, Thief. Believe me. I didn't put it there. I don't know how it got there, Lydia said, astounded. Lydia, I'm deeply disappointed in you, said Mr. Simmers, shaking his head. But I didn't do it. I didn't steal the sports cup. You've got to believe me. Then what's it doing in your locker? I don't know, sir. Mr. Simmers shook his head again. Thank you, Mrs. Irving. Mr. Bowling, that will be all. The caretaker and the history teacher each gave Lydia a grim look before walking past her without saying a word. I didn't take the cup, sir. I swear I didn't, Lydia said again. Have you told the combination number of your locker to anyone else? Asked Mr. Simmers. Reluctantly, Lydia shook her head. If only she had. Could someone else have memorised the number while you were opening it? Asked Mr. Simmers. Lydia racked her brains. She always cupped her left hand over her right when she was opening a locker, so that no one would see her number. I don't think so, sir, she whispered at last. Then I failed to see how the cup could have got into your locker. If you didn't put it there, no one else could have put it there. Mr. Simmers frowned. If this was some kind of foolish prank, Lydia, then I have to tell you I'm not amused. Now, I don't believe you really meant to steal it, otherwise you'd have taken it home with you. Certainly you'd have taken it off the school premises. As yet, I failed to grasp your motivation for removing the cup, but I intend to make an example of you. I won't tolerate such behaviour. But I didn't do it, sir. You've got to believe me. Lydia, Mr. Simmers said quietly. Mr. Bowling has informed me that he saw you in the assembly hall last night after school. He didn't know your name, but he recognised you when I brought you into the cloakroom. Lydia swallowed hard. That explained the look that had passed between them. Were you in the assembly hall last night? Mr. Simmers asked. Lydia could feel herself shaking. She felt as if she were tipping over, as if the ground was disappearing out from under her feet. Tell him about Anne hiding by the stage hall. You weren't alone. Tell him. But Lydia didn't want to get Anne into trouble as well. Besides, what good would it do? Nothing would change the fact that the cup had been found in her locker. I didn't do it. Lydia, did you take the cup? No, sir, I never touched it. You'd swear to that. Lydia couldn't say any more. She had touched it last evening. She had reached out her hand and touched it. That image kept spinning around her head. There's a very easy way to clear all this up. I can call in the police and have the cup checked for your fingerprints, said Mr. Simmers grimly. Lydia trembled violently, her mouth filled with saliva. She swallowed over and over to stop herself from throwing up all over her shoes. The police? Should I do that, Lydia? Mr. Simmers asked. A small pulse throbbed in his neck. Lydia watched it mesmerised. Answer me! Lydia jumped. Slowly, oh so slowly. She shook her head. But I didn't take it. Even to Lydia's ears, her voice sounded weak and unconvincing. Lydia tried again. I didn't take it. Which class do you have now? Mr. Simmers sighed. Double English, with Mr. Fine. Lydia replied, her voice quivering. Her throat and eyes felt as if they were full of shards of broken glass. He's your form teacher, isn't he? Mr. Simmers asked. Lydia nodded. I'll take you back to your class, Mr. Simmers continued. You're to come and see me at lunchtime. I should have worked out a suitable punishment by then. He shook his head. I would never have thought it of you, Lydia. I thought you were sensible. But that's not fair, Lydia. If you didn't take the cup, who did? Asked the headmaster, exasperated. I don't know, Lydia answered miserably. Then perhaps you'd like to tell me why anyone would want to put the cup in your locker. I don't know that either. The headmaster pursed his lips. You don't seem to know much, Lydia. Explain to me how the cup found its way into your locker, when only you know the combination. Or are you accusing Mr. Bowling? Lydia didn't speak, didn't move. She didn't trust herself to do either. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run out of the cloakroom and out of the school and just keep on running. If you knew the answer to just one of my questions, I might be more inclined to believe your pleas of innocence, said Mr. Simmers. Lydia's mind whirled as she walked back to her classroom. How had the sports cup gone into her locker? She hadn't put it there. She chickened out of stealing it at the last minute. just as Anne said she would. So how had it got there? It was too much of a coincidence that she'd been talking to Anne about taking it, and then it turned up in her locker, which meant only one thing. Somehow Anne was involved, but how had Anne known the combination number to a locker? And why would she do such a thing? But it had to be Anne. Who else would it be? Slowly Lydia shook her head. I'm letting my imagination run riot, and it's just a coincidence, she decided wretchedly. The whole thing was so confusing. Why would Anne, or anyone else for that matter, want to get her into trouble? Mr. Simmers, Lydia entered the class, just as Mr. Fine was pleading with Frankie. Francis, could you please come up here and make this rotten DVD work? You have the knack, I don't. Mr. Fine looked that close to kicking the stand that held the DVD player and the TV across the room. Frankie raised her eyes heavenwards and stood up. Lydia recognised that look. Every time Mr. Fine played a DVD, it was always the same thing. Frankie always ended up having to operate it or fix it because the teacher didn't have a clue. When Frankie saw Lydia and Mr. Simmers, however, she sat down again. Ah, Mr. Fine, a word. Lydia, return to your seat. Mr. Simmers and Mr. Fine stood with their backs to the class. Lydia was unable to hear what they were saying, but she heard her name being repeated over and over. She sat down next to Frankie, who frowned at her, but said nothing. Lydia sat at her desk and got out her English workbook. She opened it. The words swam in front of her. She didn't want to look at anyone, or talk to anyone. She needed to be by herself, to think. Seconds later she heard, "Is it true you tried to swipe our sports cup?" Lydia quickly raised her head from the book. Sean, who sat in front of her, had an accusing look on his face. "Keep your voice down," Lydia pleaded. "Well, did you try to fleece our sports cup or not?" Sean repeated at the top of his voice. Lydia's face burned white hot fire as she felt all eyes in the classroom on her. "Sean Lucas, be quiet!" Mr. Fine glared at him before turning back to the headmaster. I never did," Lydia stammered. "Do me a favour." Then, "What was it doing in your locker?" Sean scoffed. Lydia heard Frankie inhale sharply from beside her. "How did you know it was found there?" Lydia whispered. "Anne was in the cloakroom getting a pencil case when you arrived there with Mr. Simmers." She heard everything. Sean took great delight in telling her. Lydia glanced over at Anne, who sat beside the window. Anne was watching her, a knowing, contemptuous expression on her face. "I never took the cup. I haven't a clue how it got into my locker," Lydia protested. She turned to Frankie, who was reading her English workbook, as if it had suddenly become the most riveting thing she'd ever seen. "Frankie, you believe me, don't you? I never took the sports cup." As Lydia watched, Frankie glared across at Anne before returning to her English workbook without saying a word. "You've got a nerve. You come up here, steal our cup, and you think you can get away with it," said Sean. Lydia clamped her lips together. "I didn't reckon you for a, what do you call it down in London? A tea leaf," Sean said maliciously when Linda didn't speak. "I'm not a thief," Lydia protested. "No? Then how did the cup get into your locker then?" Sean taunted. "Leave me alone," Lydia said fiercely. She looked across the room at Anne. Anne was grinning at her, a satisfied smirk on her face. The volume of chatter in the class had risen now, her whole body burning up. Lydia knew they were all talking about her. "That's quite enough noise." Mr. Fine turned back to his class, his brown black eyes glinting with annoyance. "And if I have to tell you again, Sean, you will spend the rest of this double lesson standing in the corner of the room." "Tea leaf!" Sean directed one last salvo before turning to face the front again. "Thank you, Mr. Simmers. I'll make sure it gets done," said Mr. Fine. Lydia glanced up from her book to see Mr. Simmers watching her. She quickly glanced down again, listening as the headmaster left the room. Her face was on fire. But why? She'd done nothing wrong. So why did she feel so guilty? Because she'd touched the cup. She'd actually touched it. And she'd come so close to taking it. At the sound of the closing door, the class was unusually quiet. "That's more like it," Mr. Fine said. "Now let's keep it that way for the rest of the morning. Take out your English workbooks. Exercise 15. Frankie, I need to talk to you," Lydia said, as quietly as she could. "I need your help." Frankie didn't look at her. Lydia shook Frankie's forearm under the desk. Frankie, I didn't steal the sports cup. I swear I didn't, Lydia whispered. Still, Frankie didn't look at her. Don't you believe me? Lydia asked desperately. Please, Frankie, I need to talk to you. It's about the cosmics and what Anne said to me about... Lydia Hanson, don't you think you're in enough trouble without adding to it? Mr. Fine appeared from nowhere to stand before her desk. Lydia looked around. Everyone was watching her, and Lydia knew they all thought she was guilty. Even Frankie didn't believe her. Lydia couldn't stand any more. Her eyes stung with unshed, unwelcome tears. All at once, her cheeks were wet, and Lydia knew she was crying. Sir, can I go to the toilet, please? Lydia whispered. Mr. Fine frowned at her. Go on then. Hurry up. Lydia stood up, walked slowly to the door, her head bent so that no one could see her face, so that no one could catch her eye. Her hand had just reached the door handle when behind her, very softly, very simply, someone called out, Thief! Sean Lucas, up here now, Mr. Fine ordered furiously. Lydia left the classroom, closing the door quietly behind her.